The poorest people are not always the ones with empty wallets. Sometimes they're the ones who no longer believe kindness still exists. A cold November wind swept through the streets of Manhattan, carrying dried leaves across the sidewalk as thousands of people hurried home without lifting their eyes from their phones. Office towers glowed against the darkening sky, yellow taxi cabs crawled through evening traffic, and holiday lights had already begun appearing in storefront windows even though Thanksgiving was still weeks away. The city looked beautiful from a distance, but on the sidewalks it felt different. Fast, loud, indifferent. Grace Mitchell pulled the collar of her faded gray coat tighter around her neck as she stepped out of the grocery store, her paper bag barely heavy enough to fill one hand. Inside rested a loaf of discounted bread, a can of tomato soup, and a small carton of milk she had calculated down to the last cent. She paused beneath the awning to escape a light drizzle, opened her worn leather wallet, and stared silently at what remained. One single dollar bill, crisp enough to look almost new, yet impossibly heavy. It was all she had until Friday's paycheck, still 4 days away. 4 days could feel like forever when rent was already overdue and the landlord had taped another reminder to her apartment door that morning. She gently folded the bill back into its place and whispered to herself, "Just make it last." It wasn't fear in her voice. It was practice. Grace had become remarkably good at stretching hope farther than money. She adjusted the strap of her canvas tote and started walking toward the subway station, passing people wrapped in expensive wool coats and polished leather shoes. Nobody noticed the young woman whose boots had been repaired twice with glue or whose scarf had tiny stitches where it had torn last winter. She wasn't looking for anyone's attention anyway. She only wanted to get home before the rain grew heavier. As she approached the entrance to the station, something caught her eye. Near one of the stone columns sat an older man wearing layers of worn clothing beneath an oversized jacket that had clearly seen better days. His beard was uneven, his hands were pale from the cold, and beside him rested nothing but a paper coffee cup with a few coins scattered inside. Most pedestrians curved naturally around him without making eye contact. Some frowned. Others simply pretended he wasn't there. Grace slowed her pace. The man wasn't calling out. He wasn't asking loudly for help. He simply watched the stream of strangers pass by as though he had already accepted being invisible. She walked a few more steps before stopping completely. Something about the quiet dignity in his tired blue eyes reminded her of her late father during the difficult months before illness had taken him. He had hated accepting help. He had smiled even when life had become unbearably hard. Grace closed her eyes for a brief second, took a slow breath, then turned around. She walked back until she stood in front of the man. He looked up, surprised that someone had actually stopped. "Miss," he said softly, almost apologetically, "I'm sorry to bother you. Would you happen to have $1? Just enough for something warm tonight." Grace instinctively reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers found the folded bill immediately. She held it tightly without pulling it out. $1. Her last dollar. Tomorrow morning, she could use it for a cup of coffee before her shift, or a bus ride if the weather turned worse, or save it in case something unexpected happened. Every practical thought rushed through her mind at once. Then another thought quietly pushed them aside. If $1 could mean survival for her tomorrow, maybe it meant hope for someone else tonight. She slowly unfolded the bill, looked at it for one final moment, and smiled with the kind of smile that carried both uncertainty and peace. "I was saving this," she admitted honestly, "but I think you probably need it more than I do." She placed the bill into his trembling hand. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The man's eyes widened with genuine disbelief, as though the gift itself mattered less than the fact that someone had trusted him. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice almost breaking. "You have no idea what this means." Grace shrugged gently, trying to hide the sudden emptiness in her own pocket. "Maybe someday someone will do the same for me." She turned and disappeared into the flow of evening commuters without ever noticing the black luxury SUV parked quietly across the street, where behind dark-tinted glass, another pair of watchful blue eyes had witnessed every single second of what had just happened. Grace reached her apartment just before 8 o'clock, climbing 4 flights of narrow stairs that creaked beneath every step. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and laundry detergent, and the buzzing ceiling light flickered the way it always did whenever the weather turned damp. Apartment 4B stood at the very end of the corridor. A bright orange notice was taped across the door. Final reminder. Rent past due. Please contact management immediately. She stared at the paper for several seconds before carefully peeling it off and folding it into her tote bag instead of throwing it away. Pretending it did not exist would not make it disappear. Inside, the apartment was barely larger than a hotel room. A small couch faced an aging bookshelf filled with borrowed library books, thrift store novels, and a few framed photographs. One picture showed Grace at 12 years old standing beside her parents outside a county fair, all three smiling beneath a summer sky. She paused in front of it as she always did. "I am still trying," she whispered before setting the grocery bag on the kitchen counter. She heated the can of tomato soup, sliced 2 pieces of bread, and sat quietly beside the rain-speckled window. There was no television, no streaming subscription, no expensive distractions, just the sound of rain tapping softly against the glass while she planned the next 4 days in her head. Breakfast would have to be skipped. Lunch could wait until the employee meal during her evening restaurant shift. The electricity bill could probably be delayed another week without consequences. She had become strangely talented at turning impossible math into temporary survival. Yet despite everything, she found herself thinking about the man outside the subway station. Was he warm now? Had he found something to eat? The thought somehow comforted her more than keeping the dollar ever could have. The next morning began before sunrise. Grace wrapped herself in the same gray coat and walked nearly a mile because she no longer had bus fare. The crisp November air stung her cheeks, but she kept moving with determined steps until she reached Maple Street Bakery, where she worked mornings behind the pastry counter. Fresh cinnamon rolls filled the shop with a comforting aroma that made customers smile the moment they walked inside. Grace greeted every person with genuine warmth, even when her own stomach reminded her that she had not eaten since the previous evening. Around 10 o'clock, her manager, Linda, noticed Grace quietly rubbing her temples while arranging muffins in the display case. "You look pale today," Linda said with concern. "Did you skip breakfast again?" Grace forced a small smile. "I just overslept a little." Linda crossed her arms, clearly unconvinced, then disappeared into the kitchen before returning with a warm blueberry muffin wrapped in a napkin. "This one broke apart coming out of the oven. We cannot sell it anyway." Grace knew it was perfectly intact. Linda was simply protecting her dignity. She accepted it with grateful eyes. "Thank you. I will pay you back." Linda shook her head. "Just promise me that when life gets better, you do this for somebody else." Grace smiled softly. "I already try." After finishing her bakery shift, she spent 2 hours at the public library searching online job listings. Better opportunities seemed to require degrees she could not afford or years of experience she had never been given the chance to earn. Still, she submitted application after application, refusing to let rejection become routine. As evening approached, she headed across town to begin her second job serving tables at a family restaurant near Bryant Park. During a short break, another waitress named Megan sat beside her with a cup of coffee. "I heard Walker Foundation is hiring community outreach assistants," Megan said while scrolling through her phone. "Great benefits. Real salary. You should apply." Grace laughed quietly. "People like me do not get jobs at places like that." Megan looked up. "People like you are exactly who they claim they want. You actually care about people." Grace accepted the phone, reading the posting carefully. The position focused on neighborhood programs, food assistance, and volunteer coordination. It sounded less like a corporate job and more like something she had dreamed about since volunteering with her church years earlier. Before doubt could talk her out of it, she filled out the application during the remainder of her break and pressed submit. She slipped the phone back into her apron and returned to work without realizing that several miles away, inside a glass office overlooking the Manhattan skyline, the application had already been quietly marked for special review by someone who had not forgotten a single word she had spoken beneath the subway station awning the night before. The following morning, the city awoke beneath clear blue skies, as if the rain had washed away every trace of the previous evening. But Ethan Walker could not shake the memory of a single dollar bill changing hands beneath the subway station awning. From the top floor of Walker Technologies headquarters, Manhattan stretched endlessly beyond walls of glass. Yet his attention remained fixed on something far smaller than billion-dollar acquisitions or international expansion. Resting in the center of his walnut desk was the very same $1 bill Grace had given away without hesitation. It had been carefully flattened inside a transparent protective sleeve, not because of its monetary value, but because of what it represented. Ethan leaned back in his chair while sunlight reflected across the skyline. For nearly 2 years, he had secretly conducted what only 3 people inside his company knew existed. Officially, it was called the Human Values Initiative. Unofficially, Ethan referred to it as the Invisible Kindness Project. After inheriting Walker Technologies from his late father and growing it into one of the country's most respected technology companies, he had become increasingly disturbed by how easily wealth distorted human behavior. Every charity gala, every award ceremony, every interview introduced him to people who smiled because of his name rather than his character. Compliments became transactions. Friendships became opportunities. Even simple conversations often carried hidden expectations. So several times each year he disappeared into ordinary neighborhoods wearing inexpensive clothes, growing a rough beard, and blending into crowds where no one recognized the billionaire behind the disguise. His purpose was never to embarrass anyone or create public spectacles. He simply wanted to answer one question that had quietly followed him for years. Did genuine kindness still exist when nobody expected recognition in return? Most encounters disappointed him. People rushed past. Some avoided eye contact completely. Others offered sympathy without stopping. A few showed compassion, and Ethan always remembered them. But Grace Mitchell was different. She had paused when everyone else continued walking. She had admitted that the dollar was her last one instead of pretending generosity came easily. She had not acted like a hero. She had simply chosen someone else's comfort over her own convenience. That honesty stayed with him more than the gift itself. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Ethan called. His executive assistant, Olivia Bennett, entered carrying a digital tablet. She had worked beside Ethan for 8 years and understood the secret project better than anyone else inside the company. "Good morning," she said with a knowing smile. "I reviewed the applications for the community outreach assistant position." Ethan looked up. "Did she apply?" Olivia nodded. "Late last night. Grace Mitchell, 25 years old. 2 part-time jobs. Excellent volunteer history. No college degree, but exceptional recommendations from nonprofit organizations and community leaders." Ethan accepted the tablet without speaking. He carefully read every page of Grace's application. There was nothing dramatic about it. No exaggerated achievements. No polished corporate language. She wrote honestly about growing up in a working-class family, losing both parents within a few years, struggling financially, and believing that strong communities were built through ordinary acts of compassion rather than grand gestures. One sentence caught his attention immediately. "I cannot promise to solve every problem, but I never want someone to feel invisible when I have the chance to see them." Ethan quietly smiled. She had unknowingly described exactly what happened beneath the subway station. Olivia watched him for a moment before asking the question she already suspected the answer to. "Do you want human resources to move her directly to the final interview?" Ethan slowly shook his head. "No." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "No, not yet," he replied calmly. "One act of kindness can change a life, but one moment does not tell the whole story. I want to know who she is when life becomes difficult. I want to know whether compassion is a habit or simply coincidence." Olivia understood immediately. Ethan was not looking for perfection. He was searching for consistency. She nodded. "Then I will schedule her with the regular interview group." Ethan stood and walked toward the enormous window overlooking the city below. Thousands of people moved through the streets like tiny pieces of a living puzzle, each carrying burdens invisible to everyone else. Somewhere among them, Grace was probably finishing another exhausting shift, completely unaware that her future had quietly begun to change the moment she placed one ordinary dollar into the hands of a stranger. Ethan slipped the protected bill into the inside pocket of his suit jacket before leaving for his first meeting of the day. For reasons he could not fully explain, he had the unmistakable feeling that the next time he and Grace met, neither of their lives would ever follow the same path again. 3 days later, Grace stood across the street from the Walker Foundation headquarters, clutching a neatly organized folder that held extra copies of her resume, reference letters, and a notebook whose corners had softened from years of use. The building towered above Fifth Avenue with walls of polished glass reflecting the bright autumn sun, elegant but somehow welcoming instead of intimidating. People wearing tailored suits moved confidently through the revolving doors, while Grace glanced down at her own navy blue blazer purchased from a neighborhood thrift store for $18. She had ironed it twice the night before until every wrinkle disappeared. It still was not perfect, but it was the nicest thing she owned. She took one slow breath, whispered, "Just be yourself," and stepped inside. The marble lobby felt calm rather than extravagant. Fresh flowers stood near the reception desk. Soft piano music drifted quietly through hidden speakers, and framed photographs along one wall showed volunteers planting community gardens, serving meals, and rebuilding neighborhood centers. Grace smiled without realizing it. This did not feel like a corporation trying to impress people. It felt like a place that genuinely wanted to improve lives. A receptionist welcomed her warmly, verified her interview time, and handed her a visitor badge. "The interview panel will begin in about 15 minutes. Please make yourself comfortable." Grace thanked her and took a seat near the windows, carefully reviewing her notes even though she had practically memorized every answer she hoped to give. Around her, other applicants quietly rehearsed introductions or checked messages on their phones. Grace simply observed the room. A maintenance worker struggled to push a cart loaded with heavy boxes across the polished floor after one of its wheels became stuck. Without thinking, Grace stood up, walked over, and steadied the cart while helping him maneuver it through the doorway. "Thank you," the older man said with a grateful smile. "This wheel has been giving me trouble all week." Grace laughed softly. "Looks like it wanted a little encouragement today." The man chuckled before continuing down the hallway. She returned to her seat just as a young mother entered the lobby carrying a toddler on one hip while searching anxiously through an oversized purse. Papers slipped onto the floor. A coloring book landed several feet away. Grace immediately knelt to gather everything before the little boy could wander off. "Here you go," she said kindly, handing the woman the scattered papers. "You have enough to carry already." "Thank you so much," the mother replied with visible relief. "I am here for a meeting, and everything seems to be happening at once." Grace smiled. "I hope your day gets easier." From a discreet security office overlooking the lobby through hidden cameras, Ethan watched the interactions unfold in complete silence. Olivia stood beside him holding another tablet. "She has no idea anyone is watching," Olivia observed quietly. Ethan nodded without taking his eyes off the screen. Exactly. Grace was not performing for an interview panel. She believed no one important was paying attention, yet she helped simply because someone needed it. Ethan recognized the same effortless instinct he had witnessed beneath the subway station awning. There was no hesitation, no calculation, just quiet compassion expressed through ordinary moments. Olivia looked toward Ethan. "Would you like me to arrange the executive introduction?" Ethan smiled slightly before shaking his head. "Not yet. Let today belong to her, not to my name." Minutes later, a human resources coordinator appeared in the lobby. "Miss Mitchell." Grace immediately stood. "That is me. Please come with me." As they walked through bright hallways lined with photographs of community outreach projects, Grace admired the people smiling in every frame. They looked real, not staged for advertisements. The coordinator noticed her curiosity. "Many of these programs were suggested by employees instead of executives," she explained. "Mr. Walker believes the best ideas usually come from people closest to the community." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like someone who listens before speaking." The coordinator smiled but offered no further comment. At the same moment, one floor above, Ethan stepped away from the security monitors and entered a private elevator that descended toward another conference level. He had changed into a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, trimmed away the rough beard from his undercover appearance, and now looked exactly like the respected business leader featured on magazine covers. Yet Grace had never seen those photographs. She remained completely unaware that the quiet stranger she had helped only days earlier was now walking through the same building only a few hallways away. As she reached the interview room, the coordinator opened the door and gestured politely inside. Grace thanked her, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward with cautious confidence, never imagining that before the day was over she would come face to face with the one person she believed she would never see again. Grace entered the conference room expecting a standard interview with a hiring manager and perhaps 2 department supervisors. Instead, she found a long walnut table surrounded by 6 interviewers reviewing folders and digital tablets. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, making the room feel open rather than intimidating. A woman near the center smiled warmly and stood to greet her. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell. I am Karen Foster, Director of Community Programs. Thank you for coming." Grace shook each hand around the table before taking the seat offered to her. The interview began naturally. They asked about her volunteer experience, her 2 jobs, and the challenges she had faced while helping families with limited resources. Grace answered honestly, never trying to impress anyone with rehearsed phrases. When Karen asked why she wanted to work for the Walker Foundation, Grace paused for a moment before speaking. "Because I know what it feels like to need help, but still want to keep your dignity. I think people deserve more than charity. They deserve someone who believes they still matter." Several interviewers quietly exchanged thoughtful glances while making notes. The conversation continued for nearly 40 minutes. Grace described organizing neighborhood food drives, helping elderly neighbors complete assistance paperwork, and spending weekends serving meals through her local church. She admitted she had never managed a large nonprofit budget, but she promised she could learn any technical skill if given the opportunity. "Skills can be taught," she said with a gentle smile. "Compassion has to be practiced every day." Karen nodded appreciatively before closing Grace's folder. "Thank you, Miss Mitchell. We have one final part of today's process. Our executive director occasionally likes to meet promising candidates personally. If he is available, would you mind waiting a few more minutes?" Grace blinked with surprise. Of course not. She assumed an executive director would simply ask another question or 2 before returning to an important meeting. She certainly did not expect anything extraordinary. After Karen and the other interviewers stepped into the hallway, Grace remained alone inside the conference room. She looked toward the skyline outside the windows, quietly reminding herself not to become too hopeful. Even reaching this stage felt like more than she had expected. A few moments later, the conference room door opened again. Grace turned casually toward the sound, expecting another human resources representative. Instead, she froze. The man who entered wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, polished black shoes, and carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to leading entire organizations. His hair was neatly styled, his face clean-shaven, and there was not a trace of the tired appearance she remembered from beneath the subway station awning. Yet his eyes were unmistakable, the same quiet blue eyes. Grace slowly rose from her chair, completely speechless. Her heartbeat quickened as memories from 3 nights earlier rushed back all at once. "You?" she whispered before she could stop herself. The man smiled politely, but said nothing. He walked to the head of the conference table and placed a leather portfolio in front of him. Before Grace could make sense of what was happening, every interviewer re-entered the room. The atmosphere changed instantly. One by one, they stood beside their chairs. Karen smiled toward the newcomer. "Good morning, Mr. Walker." Grace felt the words echo through her mind before they fully registered. "Mr. Walker. Walker." Her eyes widened as every piece suddenly fell into place. The building, the foundation, the family name displayed throughout the lobby, the billionaire whose company employed thousands of people across the country. Ethan Walker looked directly at her with the same calm expression she remembered from the sidewalk. "Good morning, everyone," he said before turning gently toward Grace. "Miss Mitchell, it is nice to see you again." Grace could barely find her voice. You were." Ethan finished the sentence softly. "The man who asked for $1. Silence settled across the room. Grace looked from Ethan to the interview panel and back again, searching for an explanation that somehow made sense. "I do not understand," she admitted quietly. Ethan remained standing. "I imagine you do not." He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and carefully removed a transparent protective sleeve. Inside rested the same $1 bill she had placed into his hand only days earlier. He laid it gently on the conference table between them. "Most people believe money changes lives," he said. "Sometimes it does. But every once in a while, it is the heart behind a single dollar that reminds someone what true wealth actually looks like." Grace stared at the preserved bill in complete disbelief. She had expected an interview. Instead, she had just discovered that the stranger she thought needed help was one of the most influential men in America, and somehow the smallest gift she had ever given had become something he considered priceless. Grace remained standing, her eyes fixed on the protected dollar bill lying between them, as if the small piece of paper belonged in another world entirely. She looked back at Ethan, still struggling to connect the quiet man she had met outside the subway station with the respected billionaire whose name decorated the building around her. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would someone like you pretend to have nothing?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly took his seat at the head of the table and folded his hands together. His expression was calm, almost thoughtful, as though he had answered this question many times in his own mind, but rarely out loud. "Because when people recognize my face," he said gently, "they usually see my company before they see me. They see influence before character. They see opportunity before humanity. I wanted to know if kindness still existed when there was absolutely nothing to gain from it." Grace lowered her eyes toward the table. "So I was part of a test?" Ethan noticed the disappointment in her voice and shook his head almost immediately. "No, the test was never about you. It was about the world I live in." He glanced briefly toward the interview panel before continuing. "You did not know anyone was watching. You believed that $1 was the last money you had until your next paycheck. You even told me that yourself. Yet you still chose compassion over comfort. That cannot be rehearsed. That cannot be purchased. It can only come from who you truly are." The room grew completely silent. Karen Foster smiled softly as she watched Grace absorb every word. She had interviewed hundreds of applicants over the years, but very few had ever left Ethan genuinely moved. Grace finally looked back up. "I almost kept it," she admitted honestly. "For a few seconds I thought about buying coffee the next morning or saving it in case something happened. I was scared." Ethan smiled warmly. "That is exactly why it mattered. Generosity is easy when we have more than enough. The real measure of character appears when giving actually costs us something." Grace felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes, but quickly blinked them away. She had spent years trying to survive without asking for sympathy, and she was not about to lose her composure now. Ethan reached for a folder resting beside his portfolio and gently slid it across the table toward her. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "everyone in this room has completed the interview process. Your qualifications, your references, your volunteer experience, and today's conversations have all been carefully evaluated. My decision is not based on $1. It is based on the person you have consistently demonstrated yourself to be." Grace slowly opened the folder. Inside rested an official employment offer from the Walker Foundation. Community Outreach Coordinator. Full-time position. Comprehensive health benefits. Retirement plan. Paid volunteer initiatives. The salary printed near the bottom of the page was nearly 3 times what she earned working both of her current jobs combined. She stared at the number for several seconds before looking back at Ethan in complete disbelief. "There has to be someone more qualified," she said quietly. "There are people with better degrees, better resumes, more experience." Ethan nodded. "There are people with more credentials. That is true. But this organization already has experts. We have accountants, attorneys, analysts, and executives. What we cannot teach nearly as easily is the ability to genuinely care about another human being when nobody is watching." Grace looked around the table. Instead of skeptical faces, she found warm smiles and quiet encouragement. Karen leaned forward. "Everything Mr. Walker said is supported by your interview today. Before anyone knew who you were, you helped our maintenance employee without being asked. You helped a mother gather her belongings in the lobby. You treated every person here with the same respect. You have been interviewing since the moment you walked through our front doors." Grace let out a small laugh through the emotion building in her chest. "I did not even realize it." "Exactly," Ethan replied. "That is why it mattered." He gently picked up the protected dollar bill once more before placing it back into his suit pocket. "I am not offering you charity, Grace. I am offering you responsibility. Thousands of families trust this foundation every year. I believe you are someone who will never forget what it feels like to stand on the other side of that conversation." Grace looked down at the offer letter again, then back toward Ethan. For the first time in many years, the future no longer looked like something she simply had to survive. It looked like something she might finally have the chance to build. Grace did not sign the offer that afternoon. Instead, she carefully placed the folder back on the conference table and looked directly at Ethan with an expression that surprised everyone in the room. "May I have one day?" she asked politely. Karen glanced toward Ethan, expecting him to insist on an immediate decision, but he simply smiled. "Of course," he replied. "A meaningful decision deserves honest reflection." Grace thanked every member of the interview panel before quietly leaving the building. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, the excitement she had tried to hold together slowly gave way to uncertainty. Outside, the afternoon sunlight warmed the sidewalks, but her thoughts felt heavier than they had in weeks. She should have been celebrating. Instead, questions circled endlessly through her mind. Did she truly earn that opportunity, or had one unexpected moment changed everything? Had Ethan seen her abilities, or only the woman who gave away her last dollar? By the time she reached her apartment that evening, the employment folder remained unopened inside her tote bag. She placed it carefully on the small kitchen table beside the orange rent notice that still had not been paid. Common sense told her to accept immediately. Her heart refused to move quite so quickly. The following morning, Grace reported to Maple Street Bakery for what she assumed would be another ordinary shift. Linda noticed almost immediately that something was different. "You have been smiling and worrying at the same time since you walked in," she teased while arranging fresh croissants. "That usually means life is about to change." Grace hesitated before telling her everything, from the mysterious stranger beneath the subway station awning to discovering he was Ethan Walker himself. Linda listened without interrupting, then folded her arms thoughtfully. "So why are you uncertain?" Grace lowered her eyes. "Because I do not want my future to begin because someone felt sorry for me." Linda shook her head with quiet conviction. "Grace, I have watched you come to work exhausted after sleeping only a few hours. I have watched you give free meals to customers who quietly admitted they had forgotten their wallets, then cover the difference yourself. I have watched you stay after closing to clean without anyone asking. If someone finally recognizes your character, that is not pity. That is wisdom." Those words stayed with Grace throughout the day, yet doubt still lingered. Later that afternoon, after finishing her bakery shift, she walked directly to the restaurant where she worked evenings. Business was unusually busy, and every table filled quickly. Near sunset, a sharply dressed businessman entered with two colleagues. From the moment he sat down, he criticized almost everything. The water was not cold enough. The bread arrived too slowly. The soup was not hot enough. Grace remained patient through every complaint, answering calmly and sincerely despite the increasingly tense atmosphere. When the meal ended, the man deliberately left several bills scattered across the table instead of placing them into the check presenter. As Grace approached to clear the dishes, he looked at her and said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "I suppose every waitress has a price. Maybe this will encourage better service next time." The dining room fell strangely quiet. Grace looked at the money resting on the table, then gently gathered the plates before picking up the bills and walking directly back to him. She extended her hand with complete composure. "Sir," she said kindly, "I believe you accidentally left your change. Your meal was already paid in full, and generosity means much more when it is given with respect. I hope you have a pleasant evening." The businessman blinked in surprise as she placed the money back into his hand. His expression softened almost immediately. I apologize," he admitted quietly. "It has been a difficult day." Grace offered a warm smile. "I hope tomorrow is a better one." After the group departed, several co-workers quietly applauded from behind the service station. Megan walked over laughing. "I have never seen anyone return money so politely." Grace smiled. Some things are worth more than tips. What Grace did not know was that a familiar black luxury SUV happened to be parked across the street while Ethan attended a meeting nearby. As he prepared to leave, he glanced through the restaurant window just in time to witness the final moments of the exchange. He had not planned another test. He had simply arrived by coincidence. Yet once again, Grace chose integrity when no reward seemed possible. Sitting quietly in the back seat as the car pulled away, Ethan found himself smiling for reasons that had nothing to do with business. For the first time in many years, admiration was becoming something far more personal, and that realization surprised him more than any undercover experiment ever had. The next morning, Grace returned to the Walker Foundation carrying the signed employment agreement tucked carefully inside the same folder she had received 2 days earlier. She entered the lobby with a mixture of gratitude and determination, no longer feeling like an outsider walking into someone else's world. Instead, she reminded herself that this opportunity came with responsibility, not privilege. Karen Foster greeted her with a warm smile before leading her through orientation, introducing her to program managers, volunteer coordinators, and neighborhood partners who worked quietly behind the scenes to serve thousands of families across New York City. Throughout the day, Grace listened far more than she spoke, filling pages of her notebook with ideas, questions, and observations. She noticed that every successful program began with one simple principle. People needed to feel seen before they could believe their lives could change. That lesson stayed with her long after the meetings ended. During her second week, Ethan invited department leaders to discuss expanding community outreach into neighborhoods that traditional assistance programs rarely reached. Maps covered the conference room walls, displaying statistics, transportation gaps, and food insecurity across the city. Experienced executives proposed larger office locations, increased advertising, and new funding campaigns. Grace remained silent until Ethan noticed her thoughtful expression. "Miss Mitchell," he said gently, "you have been studying that map for several minutes. What do you see?" Every eye turned toward her. Grace hesitated only briefly before standing. "Most people who need help are already spending every day trying to survive," she explained quietly. "They cannot always travel across the city to find us. Maybe we should stop expecting them to come here." She walked toward the map and pointed to several neighborhoods. "What if we bring the services to them instead? A traveling outreach center, hot meals, job counseling, housing resources, medical referrals, all in one mobile unit that visits the same neighborhoods every week so families know exactly when help is coming." The room grew noticeably quiet. One executive frowned slightly. "That would require significant coordination and operating costs." Grace nodded. "It would. But if transportation is the barrier keeping people from rebuilding their lives, then removing that barrier becomes part of the solution." Ethan never took his eyes off her. He recognized the same mindset that had placed $1 into a stranger's hand without expecting anything in return. She naturally looked beyond convenience and focused on people. After several moments, he smiled. "Let us explore it." Within days, a small planning team was assembled, and to Grace's complete surprise, Ethan asked her to lead the pilot project despite her being the newest employee in the department. She immediately objected. "There are people here with years of experience." Ethan nodded. "Which is exactly why they will support you. Leadership is not about knowing everything. It is about remembering why the work matters." Over the next several months, Grace devoted herself completely to the initiative. She visited churches, community centers, libraries, shelters, and neighborhood associations, asking residents what they actually needed instead of assuming the foundation already knew the answers. Volunteers quickly noticed that she remembered names, birthdays, family stories, and even small conversations from weeks earlier. People who had once distrusted charitable organizations slowly began opening their doors because they believed Grace genuinely cared about them as individuals rather than statistics. The first mobile outreach vehicle finally rolled into service on a bright spring morning with a simple blue logo displayed across its side. The Last Dollar Project. Grace had objected to the name at first, insisting that one small act of kindness did not belong to her story alone. Ethan quietly disagreed. "It represents a choice," he told her. "One decision made without expecting recognition. That is exactly what this foundation exists to encourage." Within 6 months, the program expanded from one vehicle to 4, reaching neighborhoods that previously had little access to coordinated assistance. Hundreds of people found employment resources, temporary housing, counseling, and food support through the project. Newspapers praised the innovation, but Grace politely redirected every compliment toward the volunteers, community leaders, and local partners who made the work possible. Watching her from a distance during one neighborhood event, Ethan realized that the woman who once believed she had nothing left to give had inspired thousands of others to rediscover generosity in their own communities. He no longer admired her simply because of one unforgettable evening beneath a subway awning. He admired her because every single day afterward she proved that kindness was not an isolated act. It was the quiet way she chose to live her entire life. 1 year later, the Walker Foundation headquarters looked very different from the day Grace first walked through its doors carrying nothing but hope and a borrowed blazer. The lobby walls that once displayed photographs of community programs now featured new images from the Last Dollar Project. Families stood beside volunteers outside mobile outreach centers. Senior citizens smiled while receiving assistance with housing applications. Young adults celebrated new jobs. Every photograph captured the same quiet truth. One act of kindness had inspired another, then another, until compassion had become something contagious. On a bright Saturday afternoon, the foundation hosted a celebration honoring volunteers, neighborhood leaders, and the thousands of people who had helped transform the project into a national model for community outreach. Guests filled the auditorium with warm conversations and grateful laughter. Grace stood near the stage speaking with several volunteers who had become close friends over the past year. She wore a simple navy blue dress, elegant but modest, looking exactly like the woman she had always been despite how much her life had changed. Linda from Maple Street Bakery smiled proudly from the front row. Karen Foster chatted with community partners while reporters quietly prepared cameras for the evening presentation. Grace had no idea Ethan had planned something far more personal than another recognition ceremony. As the lights gently dimmed, Ethan stepped onto the stage to warm applause. He thanked the volunteers, the employees, and every neighborhood organization that had believed in the vision from the beginning. Then his voice grew softer. "Tonight is not really about celebrating a project," he said. "It is about celebrating a choice. A choice made by someone who believed that another person's dignity mattered more than her own comfort." Grace looked up in quiet confusion as Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Slowly, carefully, he removed the same transparent protective sleeve that had remained with him every day for the past year. The audience watched silently as he held it toward the lights. Inside rested the familiar $1 bill. 12 months ago, Ethan continued, this looked like ordinary money. To me, it became something far greater. It reminded me that generosity is measured by sacrifice, not by the number printed on a piece of paper. It reminded me that true wealth begins with character. He stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward Grace. The room grew completely still. Grace's eyes filled with emotion before he even reached her. Ethan stopped only a few feet away and smiled with the same warmth she had first seen beneath the subway station awning. "You once told me that maybe someday someone would do the same for you," he said quietly. "The truth is, Grace, you did much more than help one stranger. You helped me believe again that kindness still exists in this world without cameras, without applause, and without expectation." He handed her the protected dollar bill. Grace accepted it with trembling hands, noticing something she had never seen before. On the reverse side of the display case was a small engraved plaque that read, "The richest gift is the one given when nobody is watching." Tears slipped gently down her cheeks as she looked back at Ethan. He smiled, then slowly lowered himself onto one knee. A quiet wave of surprise swept through the audience. Ethan opened a small velvet box containing a simple diamond ring that reflected the soft lights above them. "Grace Mitchell," he said, his voice steady but deeply sincere. "You changed my company, my foundation, and my heart without ever trying to. You reminded me that leadership begins with humility and that love begins with choosing another person every single day. Will you marry me and continue building this life beside me?" Grace laughed softly through her tears before covering her mouth in complete disbelief. The answer had lived inside her heart long before this moment arrived. She nodded once, then again. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The audience erupted into joyful applause as Ethan gently slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to embrace her. Months later, they celebrated their wedding surrounded not by celebrities or business executives, but by volunteers, co-workers, neighbors, and the countless ordinary people whose lives had become connected through one extraordinary act of compassion. Linda baked the wedding cake. Karen gave a heartfelt toast. Outside the reception hall, the first outreach vehicle from the Last Dollar Project stood decorated with flowers instead of banners, reminding everyone where the journey had begun. Inside the foundation lobby, an identical $1 bill was displayed beneath glass with a simple message that every visitor could read before walking inside. Kindness grows when someone chooses to give before they have enough. And every person who paused to read those words unknowingly became part of the same story that had started with a young woman, a quiet stranger, and $1 that turned out to be worth far more than anyone could have imagined.